One, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12, 13. Okay, well, guess we better do something. Uh, Is it too dark? Is it okay? Gonna go to sleep? So last week we had an exam, right? I don't think anybody did too terrible on it. Most of you did pretty well. Some did great. So if you didn't do so good, don't freak out. There's plenty of opportunity to bring your grade up. And we started chapter 4, but did not get it finished because we spent half the class time on the exam. So we'll finish chapter 4 today and maybe get through chapter 5 also. We've got another exam scheduled for next week already. Who's anxious to do another exam already next week? Is anybody going to complain if we move that a week? Make it have that exam in 2 weeks instead of next week. Is that okay? Okay, we'll do that. So even if we get through chapter 5 tonight, we'll that exam next week or 2 weeks from now, it'll be on chapters 3, 4, and 5, right? Yeah. Lab kits. How many of you gotten your box of lab kits? Okay. Nowhere near everybody. Has everyone at least been able to order it? If you haven't, you need to do that because the company has started shipping them. So everyone who has bought the voucher and ordered the kits should plan on or expect to receive a box of kits. How big is that box? Yeah, I got the same box. They sent instructors a free sample, and does the box smell very good?
I didn't get a smell when I opened it.
Smell it? I guess it's the there's a couple of dead rats in there, right? Yeah. And they're in preservative. That preservative doesn't smell very good, but for the Bio 166 box, they have a dead pig in there, and that thing really smells pretty strong. I had that. I put those when they came. I put those boxes in my kitchen, and I opened them, looked what was in them, and then closed them up. And I remember I put something on top of one of those boxes. Or I think it was a jacket. Put my jacket on one of those boxes. Left it there for a couple of days. After that, the jacket needed to be washed. It stunk like that preservative. Anyway. Okay. There's a lab due tonight, right? A lab assignment. Everybody get the message about that, and at least get to look at that. That's due tonight. How long did it take to do that? Yeah. Yeah, it can be confusing. Some trial and error involved to figure it out. But compared to what would be a 3-hour lab if we were doing it in class, it shouldn't take anywhere near that. So I didn't feel too bad about that. I didn't get it online until, when was that? Friday, Saturday? If anybody tried it and never did figure it out, do it, never did.
I opened mine and it kind of did it the way that I had the last, exam where like the 2 questions were right, but it was like all six or seven, all 6 of them. So I was gonna go back in there and try to see if I could open it again. And I updated my browser to like Foxfire. I didn't see the actual questions.
Let's see. So you open it. Yeah, there's no answer. It's just numbers. The numbers correspond to the numbers of.
And the last one, the picture.
Yeah. Yeah, there's just numbers, 1, 3, or 5.
5, 11.
Yeah, those numbers correspond to the numbers on the
The activity.
the activities
That's right.
document.
Yeah, okay. And here's what I'll tell you what.
Yeah.
And it tells
Do you want a screenshot for each one of those answers or just for that?
Oh, no. No, you don't have to answer them on the website, just the,
You got a bunch of screenshots.
that's okay. No, all you need to submit, there was a document in there, right, that we put the answers and copy your screenshot onto it.
That was the, protein, the protein.
Yeah, your screenshot that just shows, what, 10, 5, 8 or something. And if your number of proteins isn't exactly right, if you get extra proteins in some of those, I don't care. I just want to see it.
I think that's what I did. I just started on.
Yeah. If you put too many, I don't think you can remove them.
Right.
So
Right.
don't start over. Just, I don't care about it. I just want to see that you did it. Right? And I hope it helped you understand transcription and translation and did not confuse you thoroughly even more. If anybody needs help with that, I can open that thing at break time and help you see how to do it. And if you're not sure what the answers should be to some of those questions, I'll help you figure out the answers before you leave tonight if you want to. Okay, what else? Oh, next week's lab, similar kind of thing. Since we don't have lab kits yet, I put together, I'm still working on it. I promise I'll get it done way sooner this time. I hope tomorrow, maybe even tonight. But I'm going to have you watch a short video illustration. It's about osmosis, diffusion and osmosis. And so you watch this video of this lady doing some experiments, some demonstrations. And then I found a website that has an interactive animations, kind of like what you did last week or this week. And you go through the steps. It's got instructions, and again, it takes a little trial and error to figure out what you're supposed to do, how to move stuff around on the screen. But then it'll show the results of this experiment, and you'll answer some questions about it. Submit that. And again, it shouldn't take too long. Maybe half hour. I don't know. But I'll try to get that online tomorrow. Okay. So chapter 4. I'm having terrible luck with this Collaborate video recording. I've been trying to record every class that I teach, and I don't think I've had a week yet when every class was recorded like I wanted it to. Either the sound doesn't work or it doesn't record it at all. So I'm trying to be extra careful. Okay, tissues. We got about halfway through this, I guess. So I'll review quickly what we covered. Tissues typically include some cells, living cells, and also non-living material, which is called the extracellular matrix. 4 basic tissue types listed there. Talked about membranes a little bit and these cell junctions. These cell junctions are mostly referring to epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue is layers of cells, and so those layers could be held together side by side, and that's what these cell junctions do. This one, the hemidesmosomes, instead of attaching cells together side by side, it attaches cells to the basement membrane beneath the layer of cells. The basement membrane is the extracellular matrix in epithelial tissue. So it's a non-living, it's like a layer of protein molecules forming a fabric or something to strengthen the layer of cells. Okay, generally, epithelial cells are, like on the left there is, epithelial tissue is mostly cells, but connective tissue is mostly non-living extracellular matrix with cells scattered throughout here and there. So a lot of space in between the cells in connective tissue is made up of the non-living extracellular matrix. Epithelial tissues are often described by the shape of their cells and whether the cells are in one layer or more than one layer. And so the terms we use for one layer is simple. 2 or more layers we say stratified. And the pseudo-stratified is this one on the lower right. It's actually one layer of cells, but it kind of looks like more than one layer because the nuclei are at different levels in different cells. So it's called pseudo-stratified. Pseudo means false. So it kind of looks like stratified, but it really isn't. It's really simple. And the shape of the cells can be squamous, cuboidal, columnar, or transitional. The transition means change. So transitional epithelial tissue can stretch without leaking. And so it's called transitional because when it stretches, the cells change shape. So that's for organs that contain liquid, like the urinary bladder. Okay, just pictures. Glands include exocrine glands that produce something that is released either to the outside surface of the body, like sweat, or it can be released into a hollow space within the body, like the salivary glands release into the mouth. There are, the pancreas releases digestive chemicals into the small intestines, the hollow part of the small intestines where the food is. So those are exocrine. Endocrine glands produce hormones. And hormones are released into body fluids, usually blood. Hormones glands are usually composed of tubes, and those tubes are surrounded by cuboidal epithelial cells that produce the substance that the gland makes. And so that we call that glandular epithelium. So if this was in a sweat gland, for example, these cells around here would make the sweat and put it into that tube, and then that tube would lead to the surface of the skin. But be the same thing for endocrine glands that produce hormones. Glands are typically some kind of tubes. Could be just a simple tube like this. Some of them are branching tubes, but they're usually surrounded by cuboidal glandular epithelial cells that produce the stuff, that whatever it is that gland makes. And then that tube leads to where the stuff is released. Hey, oh, why is this like this? Can't read the bottom. I think it might be the projector is adjusted wrong. But come on. Wanted to show that oh, it's not on here. Anyway, the pancreas is an exocrine gland, but it's also an example of an endocrine gland. So the pancreas is like two glands in one. So when we study the endocrine system, we'll find out that the pancreas produces some hormones. Anybody know what's a hormone that the pancreas produces? If you're diabetic, you probably know. Insulin. Produces insulin and glucagon, which is like the reverse of insulin. But it's also an exocrine gland because it also makes digestive enzymes that are released into the small intestine. Goblet cells. This is a goblet cell. It's an example of a gland that's just one cell. It's a one-cell gland. And these make mucus. So mucous membranes we have in a lot of parts of our body. Your whole digestive system, from your mouth all the way to the anus, is lined with mucous membranes. And this is epithelial tissue that has goblet cells in with the epithelial cells. And the goblet cells produce the mucus onto the surface of that membrane. Okay, I think we stopped around here maybe last week. This is three ways that the exocrine glands cells release what they produce. So whether it's a sweat gland, an earwax gland, mammary glands that make breast milk, the cells of those glands make the stuff, and then the stuff is released from the cells. This is how that stuff is released. three different ways: merocrine, apocrine, and holocrine. So let's just look at this diagram picture. So an example of this top one, merocrine. I think sweat glands work this way. And we learned about exocytosis, right? Exocytosis is when something is in a vesicle inside of a cell, and then that vesicle moves to the surface and releases it to the outside. That's what's happening here with this merocrine secretion. So it shows the Golgi complex there. So the endoplasmic reticulum and the Golgi complex, in this case, for example, it's making sweat. Puts the sweat in these little vesicles, the little round, look like bubbles. Then those vesicles move to the surface of the cells and release the sweat to the outside. That's called merocrine secretion. And so these cells would be like these cells lining these tubes of the gland. And the stuff would be released into the tubes. So if this was a sweat gland, then this would lead to the surface of the skin. So that merocrine secretion, that's one way it can happen. The second one, apocrine, called apocrine because the whole apex, the word apex means the tip of something. So the whole tip or apex of the cell just breaks off, or pinches off. So this is how breast milk is released from these cells. So this would be a cell in the mammary gland. The cell is making breast milk, putting it into these vesicles, and then the whole tip of the cell with the vesicles in it just pinches off and breaks off. And that's how the milk is released into the into the ducts that lead to the nipples. So that's called apocrine because the whole apex pinches off. And then the third one is holocrine. Just remember, holocrine is when the whole cell breaks apart. And this is how the oil, they're called sebaceous glands, the oil glands in your skin. This is how they work. They produce this oily stuff in these vesicles, and then the whole cell just bursts open and releases that stuff, that oily stuff, which is called sebum. Okay. And we'll talk about the sebaceous glands a little more in the next chapter, because that's part of the skin. Okay, so that was epithelial tissue, connective tissues. As the name connective suggests, many of the connective tissues function in protecting, supporting, holding parts of the body together. Some connective tissue stores fat. That's its main function, is storing fat on your body. Protecting against infection, filling spaces in between organs, producing blood cells. That would be inside in the bone marrow. Bone is a connective tissue, so the marrow is inside of the bones. So this will be a function of connective tissue. And repairing tissue damage, we'll see how healing of wounds involves some connective tissue cells. So again, connective tissue is mostly non-living extracellular matrix with a few cells scattered throughout. The extracellular matrix is usually consists of protein fibers and some ground substance. The ground substance could be like the white minerals of bones. It could be the rubbery stuff in cartilage. It It depends on what kind of tissue it is. It says connective tissues have a good nerve supply, and they're vascular, which means they have a lot of blood vessels, that's different from epithelial tissues. Epithelial tissues usually do not have blood vessels or nerves in those layers of epithelial cells. There might be some right below the epithelium, but not in the epithelial tissues. It says except for cartilage. Cartilage doesn't have its own, it doesn't have nerves running through it, typically does not have blood vessels running through it, which is why cartilage doesn't heal very well when it gets damaged. Tendons and ligaments also don't have blood vessels in them. We'll mention what tendons and ligaments are in a minute. Okay, categories. Connective tissue can be divided into these three categories, and these categories are random. In the textbook we used before this semester, there were different categories. They had different names, but so this isn't necessarily absolute truth or anything. People just like to put things in categories for convenience. So connective tissue proper, supportive connective tissue, and fluid or liquid connective tissue. So connective, first of all, there's several types of cells that can be in connective tissues. This first kind, fibroblasts and fibrocytes. The fibro refers to the protein fibers that these cells make. So these are the cells that make the protein fibers in the extracellular matrix of connective tissues. The word cyte, C-Y-T-E, means cell. So anytime you see cyte or cyto, that's referring to something to do with cells. And this word blast, B-L-A-S-T, blast is a cell that makes something. In this case, they're called fibroblasts. They make protein fibers. So both of these kinds of fibroblasts and fibrocytes, they're both cells that make protein fibers, but fibroblasts are specialized. That's all they do is make fibers, protein fibers. Adipocytes, anybody know what the word adipose means? Fat, it means fat. Adipose means fat. Everybody needs to know that word in anatomy. Adipose. Anybody know what an adipose fin is on a fish? Only trout and salmon and catfish. But behind the regular fins, some fishes have that little fleshy fin. It's called an adipose fin. So it's got fat in it. Mesenchymal cells are stem cells in the tissue. A stem cell in any kind of tissue, a stem cell is a cell who all it does is divide to make more cells. So mesenchymal cells are the stem cells in connective tissue. We have stem cells in our red bone marrow, and all they do is divide to make more red and white blood cells. Macrophages and mast cells, these are types of white blood cells that can be in many different tissues, but there are some in connective tissue for fighting diseases. And then red and white blood cells, those are included because blood is considered to be a connective tissue, as we'll see in a minute. Okay, keep talking about these fibers in the extracellular matrix of connective tissue. These are just long threads of protein molecules in connective tissue, and there's three types: collagen fibers, or sometimes called collagenous fibers. These are the strongest ones. They're made of the protein collagen, and they add strength to many connective tissues. So we have them in we have them in most or all connective, not all, but most connective tissues have these fibers, but they're especially abundant in bone. So bone tissue is this white, hard mineral stuff that makes it hard. It also has these protein fibers running through it to make it strong. Tendons and ligaments are almost entirely made of these collagen fibers. Elastic fibers, also called yellow fibers, because they're kind of yellow colored. These, as the name tells us, they're stretchy and flexible. So we have these in our vocal cords, in the larynx, the voice box. That's what vibrates to produce sound. We have them in our skin to make our skin more stretchy. Blood vessel walls, especially arteries. We have our blood vessels. Blood vessels include arteries and capillaries and veins. Arteries, when our heart pumps blood, it goes into the arteries, and then those arteries take the blood throughout the body tissues, and then the blood returns to the heart in blood vessels called veins. But the arteries, every time the heart beats and pumps blood into the arteries, those arteries bulge out, right? That's what your pulse is, just your arteries bulging out every time the heart beats and pumps blood into them. So those arteries have to be stretchy, so they have a lot of this elastic protein fibers in them. Also your lungs. Your lungs are constantly inflating and deflating, so they better be pretty stretchy. So they have these elastic fibers in them. Then reticular fibers. The word reticular means branching. So a reticular pattern just means something, any kind of branching pattern like this, just like the branches of a tree is you could describe as reticular. So these reticular proteins are branching fibers, so branching in all three directions. And so these are they just add strength, three-dimensional strength to a lot of tissues, especially soft organs like the spleen and liver and lymph nodes, that if they didn't have something like that holding them together, they would just be like mush. So this adds some structural strength to them. This is a diagram from the old textbook. It's not in your textbook, but I left it in the PowerPoint just because it shows a lot of different features of connective tissue all together here. So here's one of those fibroblast cells that make protein fibers, and here's the protein fibers that it's making for this connective tissue. The eosinophils, neutrophils, plasma cells, mast cells, macrophages, these are all types of white blood cells of the immune system. And these are not only in connective tissue, but they can be in connective tissue. And a lot of these white blood cells, they move around. They go wherever they're needed. So here we see some of these elastic fibers and collagen fibers and reticular fibers. These are all protein fibers. These adipocytes, these are fat cells. this yellow stuff is fat. So these are cells that, we'll talk about these in a minute some more, but they're specialized just for containing fat, storing fat. What else? The ground substance is just all this stuff in between the cells and the protein fibers. Everything else is this ground substance. Okay, there's those three categories of connective tissue. So connective tissue proper includes loose and dense connective tissue. Supportive connective tissue includes cartilage and bone. Then fluid or liquid connective tissue is blood and lymph. So we have to look at each of those a little bit. So this so-called connective tissue proper has fibroblasts and fibrocytes, which are cells, and then adipocytes, which are fat cells, and then mesenchymal cells, which are the stem cells that divide to make more cells. Types of loose connective tissue, which is the type of, these are all connective tissue proper. Areolar connective tissue, mostly it just fills in spaces in between organs. Most epithelial tissue has some of this areolar connective tissue underneath it. Adipose tissue is just for fat, storing fat. And so there's a layer of that beneath the skin. It's called the subcutaneous layer. And some people have a thicker layer than others. I don't have very much of that. And there's also some inside of our hollow bones. We have yellow marrow in our bones, which is storing fat, and then the red marrow is where the blood cells are made. So this fat is a way of storing energy for later. And it's also good for thermal insulation, keeps your body warm in cold temperatures. Then reticular connective tissue, that's just connective tissue that has a lot of that reticular protein fibers in it. So adding strength to other tissues and other organs. Okay, so here's that areolar connective tissue. Just ground substance with some protein fibers and cells scattered throughout. Adipose tissue. This is very easy for me to identify under a microscope because nothing else looks like this. So this is just a drawing or diagram. This is what it looks like under a microscope, but because all you see is the outlines of these cells. To me, I see that looks like chicken wire. And this is all fat. All this white is where the fat is, and just like other cells, it has a nucleus and other organelles in there, but all the nucleus and organelles, they're all squished up against those plasma membranes. They're not, most cells, you see this nucleus is kind of in the middle somewhere, and other organelles out in the middle, but in these, everything's squished up against the plasma membrane because it's all fat in there. Okay, reticular connective tissue, branching protein fibers with some cells scattered here and there. So that was loose connective tissue, three types of loose connective tissue. There's also dense connective tissue. The reason for the names loose and dense is that in the loose connective tissue, the protein fibers are there's not as many connective tissue fibers or protein fibers, but in the dense connective tissue, it's mostly protein fibers, just packed closely, densely together. So it can be regular or irregular. What regular means is it means that all the protein fibers are parallel, all running the same direction. And that's how it is in tendons and ligaments. Anybody know what tendons do? They connect something to something. Muscle to bone. Yeah, tendons connect muscle to bone. So most of the skeletal muscles in your body, like this biceps muscle, it's a long muscle and it's connected to these bones in my forearm and it's connected to the bones in my shoulder. But those connections are tendons. Tendons are just like short pieces of rope. And they're very strong because this muscles, not saying I'm especially strong, but muscles produce a lot of force. And if those tendons aren't really strong, they would just snap. They would break or pull loose from the bones. Some people do rupture this tendon a lot. That's Achilles tendon. It just breaks. So they have to be very strong, and having all those collagen fibers running in the same direction makes them very strong. Ligaments, same kind of material, but ligaments connect what to what? Not muscle to bone, it's bone to bone, bone to bone. So, ligaments are what hold my joints together. They hold my upper arm to my forearm bones. There's ligaments. There's ligaments in the knee. There's ligaments on both sides and in the front and back that hold the upper leg to the lower leg. So those are really strong, but they break sometimes. People, just have knee injuries. They rupture the ACL or PCL. Those are ligaments. The irregular connective tissue, same thing. It's a lot of collagen fibers, really densely together, but they're they're not all running in the same direction. They're running this way and this way and this way. So it's strong in all directions, not just in pulling in one direction like in tendons and ligaments. So this dense irregular connective tissue is in the dermis of the skin to make it strong, artery walls, and capsules surrounding certain organs. Okay, cartilage is a connective tissue. It's a rubbery kind of tissue that we have in a lot of parts of our body that we'll mention some examples in a minute, but the cells in cartilage are called chondrocytes, and this Latin root chondro means cartilage. So if you ever see chondro in a word, it tells you that has something to do with cartilage. There's even a group of fishes called chondrichthyes because their skeleton is made of cartilage. Anybody know what kind of fishes have cartilage skeleton? Sharks and rays. Their skeleton is cartilage instead of bone. This chondroitin sulfate, the rubbery extracellular matrix, has a lot of the stuff chondroitin sulfate in it. You can buy pills of chondroitin sulfate. People who have arthritis, you can buy chondroitin sulfate pills at Walmart. Supposedly it helps, if you have arthritis, it helps grow new cartilage or prevent your cartilage wearing out. It's controversial whether it works or not. Some people swear by it, and they take it every day. Other people say it's a waste of money and doesn't do any good. Even doctors don't agree whether it works or not. So it's just rubbery stuff with a lot of collagen and elastic protein fibers running through it to give it strength and flexibility. No vascular system, so it heals slowly. Um, um, very often, if you have an injury to cartilage, it might never heal. We have these thick cartilage pads in the knees called meniscus pads, and a lot of football players, they get hit sideways in the knees and it just splits that cartilage open and splits it in half. And surgeons try to repair that, but especially in the past, surgeons they just see that and they just remove it, just take it out. It's not going to heal. That guy can maybe play football a few more years, but he's going to have arthritis in that knee 15 years from now. Our people have arthritis in joints because the cartilage wears away. That usually doesn't grow back. Usually, when cartilage is gone, it's gone. Okay, 3 types of cartilage: hyaline, fibro, and elastic. The hyaline type is we have more of that than the other 2 in our body. But in fact, when you were an embryo and a fetus, your skeleton was made of cartilage. So your bones, most of your bones in your body started out as little bits of cartilage. They looked like bones, but they were actually soft, like cartilage. And even after after a baby is born, the skeleton is still kind of rubbery. If you drop a baby on the floor, it just kind of bounce. Probably won't break anything. We have it. That's the kind of cartilage that's at the end of the bones. It's called articular cartilage because the word articulation means a joint. So that's the kind of cartilage that we have at the end of the bones. Wherever there's two bones that come together at a joint, the ends are covered with that hyaline cartilage that makes the joints work smoothly, slippery. Also have them in the rib cage. The ribs are made of bone, but this inch or 2 of ribs where they attach to the sternum bone here, the breastbone, that's cartilage, and that's what allows us to do chest compressions for CPR. If that cartilage wasn't there and you try to do that, you just break the bones. But that cartilage makes it flexible enough. How far can you compress? 2 inches for CPR. That's a lot. It's a lot of flexibility there. Also, the tip of the nose and is hyaline cartilage, and the respiratory passages you can feel on your trachea here that you breathe through in front. You rub your fingers up and down, you can feel that that's surrounded by rings of cartilage, this hyaline cartilage, and those rings of cartilage are what keep that trachea open, keep it round so it doesn't collapse, so you can breathe through it. If somebody gives you a karate chop in the neck, you can fracture or crush those cartilages. That would be a bad day if that happened to you. Okay, fibrocartilage. It's called fibro because it has a lot of collagen fibers running through it to make it strong, very strong. And so we have that in a few places. It's good for shock absorption. So we have them, the intervertebral discs. Intervertebral means between the backbones. So your spine is a stack of bones, and in between the bones are these little thin discs of fibrocartilage. And so that's what allows me to twist. Each one twists just a little bit, but my whole spine can twist about 90 degrees. And bend sideways and forward because of those flexible discs. And also, if I fall on my butt, that impact will be absorbed by those discs in my back. Each one absorbs a little bit of that impact. The pubic symphysis, the pubic area is here, the groin area, and so I have a left and right hip bone, and where they connect in the middle and front is this little, about a 1/4 inch thick layer of cartilage called the pubic symphysis. That's especially important in women during pregnancy because it allows the hips to flex apart a little bit, especially at childbirth, for the little guy to come out through the birth canal. And there's meniscus pads in the knees, in between the upper leg bone and lower leg bone. There's these cartilage pads on the either side called meniscus pads. That's fibrocartilage. Then elastic cartilage, we have that in the epiglottis. We haven't learned what that is yet, but you have this airway that you breathe through, and another tube that you swallow through, and we use the same pharynx, the upper part of your throat. We use the same tube for swallowing and breathing. But then when it gets to about this level, they separate, and the air goes down the front pipe, and the food or liquid goes down the pipe in back, the esophagus. So this epiglottis is a flap that it's normally open when you're breathing or talking, but when you swallow, that flap automatically moves down and closes off your airway so that food or liquid goes into your lungs and not into your stomach and not your lungs.
That's what happened to my baby. When he was born, 2 months, he was immature. So he had aspiration pneumonia.
It didn't seal off right.
Right. He was wanted to his lungs instead of wanted to his stomach.
What was the treatment for that?
I had to give him a thick and feeding. Yeah, I had to give like if he had 4 ounces of milk, I had to give 2 ounces of cereal. Yeah, to his milk.
He turned out okay? Just took a while to develop, right?
So, well, I didn't know that that was the problem. You know, I took him to the doctor, they thought it was the cold. So I kept, using the nasal.
Yeah.
And then one day it was like some white stuff was coming out his nose. So I rushed him to Scotland Hospital. They couldn't do anything for him because they didn't know, they didn't have the equipment. So they sent him to Duke. So he stayed up there in Duke for like 2 months, and then they found out that it was that flap, it wasn't mature. They said it was opening, but it wasn't closing. So the milk was going into his lungs, not into his stomach.
Yeah. Oh, great. Well, sorry that happened, but it made a good story to tell in class.
Yeah.
Okay, the auditory or eustachian tubes, those are the tubes that go from the middle ear behind the eardrums into the throat. So they're made of this kind of cartilage, and these tubes we don't normally notice we have them, but some kids, their tubes are blocked and they have to have fake tubes put in. But you notice this if you're maybe flying in an airplane or you're driving in a car, you go up or down a long hill, and your ears pop. The popping is because the atmospheric pressure changes. If you go up high, the pressure is lower. If you go downhill, the pressure is higher, just because there's more air above you in the atmosphere, and that air is pushing on your eardrums. To equalize that pressure, air from your throat will move out up into your middle ears behind your eardrums. That's what that popping is. Or it could go the other way. so that the pressure is the same on both sides of the eardrum. Okay, oh, the external ear, this is called the pinna of the ear, the outer part, that's that elastic cartilage as well. Okay, so they are all more or less the same. This rubbery stuff with fibers running through it and cells scattered here and there. Okay, bone is also called osseous tissue. This osseous or osteo. See osteo in a word, it has something to do with bone. So this is hard and rigid. Rigid means stiff connective tissue. So it supports, protects, so it supports. If I didn't have a skeleton made of bones, I would just be a blob on the floor here. So my skeleton helps support the rest of my body. It protects. Some of our bones protect organs, like my skull protects my brain, my ribs and my sternum and my spine. They all surround my heart and lungs, protect them. My pelvis surrounds some lower organs. Helps provide movement because I have muscles attached to the bones and I have joints between my bones, so it allows me to flex and extend and twist joints. Stores minerals. Our bones are made of mostly calcium and phosphorus, or the calcium phosphate compound. This mineral is called hydroxyapatite. So that's what the white hard stuff of your bones is. This hydroxyapatite mineral. And there's also magnesium and other minerals in there, and that stuff doesn't only make up your bones, but that stuff is there so that if you don't get enough of that stuff in your diet, some days, it'll be taken out of your bones. So if you don't get enough calcium in your diet today or this week, that your body will take that out of your bone tissue and use it. Hope it'll be put back on other days. Because you take more out than you put in, then you end up with, what's that condition called, where you lose bone mass? Osteoporosis. So bone also has collagen fibers running through it to add strength. And bone does have a good blood supply, so your bones have blood vessels running through them and also nerves. So when you break a bone, it heals really fast because that blood delivers enough nutrients to support that healing, to rebuild the bone tissue really fast. Okay, this is, we'll study bone tissue more when we do the skeletal system chapter later this semester, but if you take a cut through one of these bones and you look at the cross-section of the bone through a microscope, it looks like kind of like the rings of a tree. Cut through and you see the rings. And down the center of the rings, there's usually a hollow tunnel that might have blood vessels or nerves running through it. Okay, fluid connective tissues or liquid. I prefer the word liquid. Something always bothers me about the word fluid. I used to be a mechanical engineer, and in engineering and physics, the word fluid means a liquid or a gas. So air is a fluid, and water is a fluid. But in medicine, when medical doctors talk about fluid, what they mean is liquid. And so it always seems odd to me when I hear doctors say that, talk about with pneumonia, person's lungs are filling with fluid. What they mean is filling with liquid, because lungs are supposed to fill with fluid. Every time you inhale, they're filling with air, which is a fluid. But when a doctor says it's fluid, he means liquid. I've never gotten used to that. Anyway, blood is a liquid connective tissue, and we'll do a whole chapter on blood next semester. I think it's next semester. The liquid part of the blood is called plasma, and then there's also blood cells, red blood cells called erythrocytes, carrying oxygen, and there's several different types of white blood cells called leukocytes, and those are immune system cells. Each one fights infections or diseases in different ways. And there's also platelets. Platelets are not cells. They're described as cell fragments. A platelet is just like a little droplet of cytoplasm with a plasma membrane around it, but it's not really alive. Platelets function in forming a plug when a blood vessel starts to bleed. When a blood vessel is cut and starts to bleed, the platelets get sticky and they stick to each other and they stick to the blood vessel and they form a plug called a platelet plug to stop the bleeding. So let's look at this. This is if you put a drop of blood on a microscope slide and smear it thin, put a cover slip on it. That's what we call a blood smear. So this the liquid part here in between the cells, that's the plasma, and then these are the red blood cells, and they have this white spot in the center because they're thinner in the center than around the edges. And remember, with a regular light microscope, the light comes up through the specimen, so that's why we see this whitish spot in the center. No nucleus in red blood cells. They don't have a nucleus. These little tiny ones are the platelets, and these, the ones that do have a nucleus, those are the red blood cells, or the white blood cells. And there's several different kinds of white blood cells. In one way that you can tell which type of white blood cell you're looking at is the shape of the nucleus. If this nucleus is small and that one's big and round, so different kinds of white blood cells have different kinds of nucleus. Okay, lymph. Lymph is another kind of liquid connective tissue, and our blood vessels are always leaking. Our capillaries are always leaking liquid. The plasma is leaking out of them into the surrounding tissues. The capillaries are the little tiny blood vessels that run through almost all of our tissues and where the oxygen leaves and goes into the tissues. And we have something like many thousands of miles of capillaries in our body. And so they're always leaking a little bit of plasma into the tissues, and now that liquid just becomes the tissue fluid, the liquid that surrounds all of the cells in our tissues. But if you have too much of that tissue fluid, then we call that swelling, right, or edema. So we have a lymphatic system, the system of tubes that absorbs that excess tissue fluid, and all those tubes lead to the shoulders where that lymph is added back into the blood where it leaked out of in the first place. And so this lymph is just tissue fluid that is absorbed into these lymphatic vessels. Once it gets into those lymphatic tubes or vessels, we call it lymph. And it's really almost the same composition as blood plasma. So that's what it used to be. But it doesn't have red blood cells in it, but there is a lot of white blood cells in the lymphatic system. The lymphatic system is important for immune system function. Okay, let's see. Practice questions. Okay, so we talked about epithelial and connective tissue. Jenny talked a little bit about muscle and nervous tissue, but we have whole chapters on these, so we're not going to go into a whole lot of detail. Muscle tissue is for movement, for providing movement. Muscle cells are capable of doing something that other cells cannot do, and that is they can get shorter and provide pulling force. So that's what meant by they're contractile. They can contract or get shorter. And they're also excitable, which means something stimulates them to do that. Something causes them to get shorter. And it's usually nerve impulses. So muscles can only pull. They can get shorter and pull. So if I want to bend my elbow, I got these biceps muscles that will get shorter to pull my elbow bent. What if I want to straighten my elbow? Can the same muscles push? Muscles cannot push, they can only pull. So if I want to straighten that muscle, straighten that elbow joint, that's why I have muscles on the other side. To straighten that, these muscles contract, and they're attached to the end of my forearm bone, actually behind the joint. So when they pull by leverage, it straightens my elbow. So in most joints that can bend and straighten, we have muscles on both sides. So and muscles on the front here to straighten my knee, and muscles in the back to bend it. The muscles behind my foot to bend my foot down, also muscles in front to bend it up. Okay. Some muscle movement is voluntary under conscious control, and some are involuntary. That means, well, the muscles, the skeletal muscles on my bones are voluntary. That means I decide in my cerebrum of my brain that I want to contract a muscle, and I make it happen. So I'm thinking I want to bend my left elbow, so it happens because I decided it's voluntary. But the other two types of muscle, cardiac and smooth. Where do we have cardiac muscle? The heart. That's what cardiac means, right? So that's the only place we have cardiac muscle. The heart is actually a big hollow muscle. It's not big. It's about the size of your fist. But we don't control that voluntarily. I can't say, I'm feeling a little sluggish. I think I'm going to speed up my heart rate. You can't do that. It's automatic. Or I can't decide to commit suicide by just stopping my heart. Say, I'm done. Damn it, I'm just going to stop my heart. It won't. And smooth muscle is muscle of many of our internal organs, and it surrounds blood vessels. So, for example, your blood vessels, many of your blood vessels are capable of constricting, getting narrower, or getting bigger to regulate how much blood is flowing to different tissues. You don't always need a lot of blood going to every tissue. And that's because those blood vessels are surrounded by smooth muscle. And again, that's involuntary. You can't consciously control it. It happens automatically. Other internal organs have smooth muscle. It's like your stomach. You swallow food into your stomach, it stays in there a few hours digesting, and then it moves on into the small intestines. How does it move on? The stomach is surrounded by smooth muscle that contracts and squeezes it on through. That's involuntary. You can't decide when to make it happen or not. It's all automatic. So muscle produces motion, maintains posture. So even if I'm just standing straight up here, I'm not moving, but I'm definitely using my muscles to stay in this upright position. I have to have muscles contracting. Um, Produces heat. Every time you contract a muscle, it generates some heat. That's why you get hot when you exercise or work hard physically. Constricts tubes, like I mentioned, a couple examples. Protects internal organs. I said that earlier that, for example, my rib cage and sternum protects my heart and lungs. What about these organs down here? My stomach and intestines here, there's no bones surrounding them, but there's actually a pretty thick layer of muscle, abdominal muscles and back muscles that protect those organs pretty well. Um, oh, and this that last line there, muscle cells are called fibers or myocytes. Myo means muscle, so if you ever see anything with myo in it, that's a clue that it has something to do with muscles. So there's that cyte again, cyte means cell. But the word fiber, we usually use the word fiber for muscle cells. That can be confusing because when we were talking about connective tissue, I kept talking about these fibers running through the connective tissue. Those are protein molecules. But if we're talking about muscle, fibers are cells. So, but they're called fibers because they're long. Muscle cells are long. So a little bit more about the three types of muscle tissue. Skeletal muscle, the cells or fibers are long like spaghetti. And so a muscle like this biceps muscle, the muscle fibers or cells in there, each one runs the whole length of the muscle. It's like long spaghetti. So each muscle is like a bundle of those long spaghetti-shaped fibers. And you see these long dark things, those are nuclei, and says many nuclei. So each muscle cell or muscle fiber in skeletal muscle has several nuclei in one cell, and that's because when I was an embryo and a fetus and my muscles were developing, each one started out as several cells in a row with a nucleus, and then they all fused together into one long cell, but they still have all those nuclei left over. Striated. You know this word in muscle. These lines or these stripes or bars across the muscle fibers, those are called striations, and so that's why skeletal muscle is said to be striated. It looks like corduroy. Smooth muscle. The cells are not long like spaghetti. They're long, but they're kind of pointed on the end, and they overlap each other. Only one nucleus per cell. Not striated, so you don't see any lines across those cells, and that's why it's called smooth, because it doesn't have striations. Involuntary. And then the cardiac. It is striated. You can see in this drawing, you can see the striations, and not so evident in this picture, this photograph. They're very faint, but there are lines across the cells. And the shape of the muscle fibers, they're long, but they're not long like spaghetti, like in the skeletal muscle, and they're branched. This one has a branch right here. This one has a branch here. And they're connected end to end. So these dark lines are where two muscle cells are connected end to end, and those are called intercalated discs. Only cardiac muscle has those intercalated discs. Just one nucleus per cell, involuntary. Okay. Okay, that's all we'll say about muscle for now, I guess. And then nervous tissue, again, we'll do a whole chapter on this later. But for communication by nerve impulses that go from one end of these long cells to the other. Oops, I touched that touch screen again. Two kinds of cells in nervous tissue. The neurons are the actual nerve cells that conduct nerve impulses. But then there are several kinds of cells called neuroglia that are helper cells for the neurons. And the different kinds of neuroglia help the neurons in different ways. And when we do that chapter, we'll find out what they do. But there's actually way more neuroglia than there are neurons in the nervous system. There's way more helper cells than there are the actual nerve cells. So the neuroglia are important. This is a diagram of a neuron. This big fat part here is called the cell body, and that's where the nucleus and most of the other organelles are. And then there's usually a bunch of these branching extensions sticking out called dendrites. Dendra means tree in Latin, so these are branched like trees. They look like trees. And then there is usually one long extension, and this one can be 1 or 2 or 3 feet long. So one very long cell. This is called the axon, and it can also be branched. So nerve impulses come in through the dendrites to the cell body, and then the cell body will decide if the cell should send out its own nerve impulse out through this axon. And so this could lead to a muscle to make it contract. This could lead to this could lead to the dendrites of another neuron to relay the message to someplace in the body. And to confuse things even further, another word for axon is fiber. So the word fiber can mean protein fibers in connective tissue, or it can mean an entire cell in muscle tissue, or it can mean just the axon of a neuron in nervous tissue. Okay, practice questions. Well, tissue repair. Tissue repair, that just means healing, right? Healing damaged tissue. Like I've said before, some types of cells just don't live very long, or they wear out and they have to be replaced, even if there is no kind of traumatic injury or anything. That's what stem cells do, like the basal cell, the stratum basale cells in the epidermis of skin. They divide to make new cells. There's mesenchymal cells in connective tissue. They divide to make more cells. They just do that normally all the time. But some tissues are able to repair themselves if the tissues get damaged or injured. Muscle cells, most muscle cells cannot repair themselves very well, like skeletal muscle cells. If they're damaged or destroyed, you're probably not going to get them back. You pretty much have what you were born with. Some nervous tissue can repair itself, but if it's in the brain or spinal cord, probably not. They just don't grow back. They don't regenerate. The cells don't divide to replace lost ones. This word fibrosis means formation of scar tissue because the scar tissue, after an injury, the scar tissue that's left, that's actually collagen fibers from the healing process. So here's an injury, could be a cut through the skin, through the dermis, and maybe even into muscle below it. So there will be white blood cells coming to the area. Some of the white blood cells will be in the blood. They'll actually leave the blood and go out into the tissues where they're needed to try to fight off any bacteria or other pathogens that are entering through that cut. And also these fibroblasts from the connective tissue. Remember, these are the connective tissue fibers, connective tissue cells that make protein fibers like collagen. They'll come to the area and they'll start filling in this cut with collagen fibers. And meanwhile, the skin cells, the epidermis cells above that will fill in. So epidermis tissue will fill in the cut above that. But even after it's healed, even after the epidermis is healed over, because of these collagen fibers beneath that, you can often still see a scar. You're seeing that's often a scar tissue looks kind of shiny compared. It doesn't look like normal skin because there's all that collagen beneath that. So this is one reason why if you get a deep cut, you should pull the edges together and suture them or tape them with a butterfly bandage or steri strips or something. So to minimize how much of this collagen will have to fill in that gaping space there and minimize the scar that results. Okay, okay, we're almost done here. We'll take a break. Okay, is it better to be young or old? Young bodies generally have better blood supply, faster metabolic rate, better nutrition, faster healing, less scarring, just generally heal better and faster compared to old people. And some videos, if you want to look at them, might be helpful. Okay, let's take a break till, I don't know, 20 till or something. Oh, by the way, I have your exams. I don't remember if I mentioned it. If you want your exam back, you can come pick it up. If you don't want it, that's okay.
I did say.
I got both.
Okay, awesome.
I guess I couldn't even hold my own child.
I think these are alphabetical.
Yeah, you should
I saw this number. That's what, I was like, oh.
Yeah, that'll make your heart skip a beat.
Yeah, that's why I was like, no, I don't think it's that.
Do you remember you put a name on the
Yes. Awesome, thank you.
most didn't?
Oh, I didn't even put his name on it.
Okay, Shay.
You just cussed him.
Oops.
I didn't write my name on it.
Okay, so it doesn't matter which one.
Thank you.
Oops, shoot.
Okay, I'm having problems pulling up that lab. Whenever I pull it, the words all scrambled together.
Is it working better?
Yeah, it is. I know usually all of this cross.
Hmm.
And I put the wrong eyedrops in. Mr. Big, number 5 wasn't even on there to print.
Yeah, I know, I'm sorry, I'm just getting it ready now.
So that means we didn't leave early, didn't know.
It was on there, but I had, I'm making excuses, right? You're not interested in excuses, right? It was on there, but I updated the PowerPoint, last night and I forgot to put it on there. the
You
updated
said we're
version.
gonna have a test in 2 weeks, right?
2 weeks, yeah. Unless you beg me to have it next week, then I,
Fine, fine. That's it.
Notice if you're refusing to go across that way.
Excuse me, did you do the light? Did you pull up at the same time?
I had my husband print the paper out for me, so I was able to follow it that way. So it's easier to follow it that way, because when you pull it, it pulls the screen.
So follow the paper when we run the quiz.
Oh, the quiz is literally just answering those questions. How are you answering them on paper? You just fill it in, and you have to take a picture, um, where you completed the exercise, and that's the very last thing you have to. That's all it is. It's not that hard. You just follow the directions and you can do it. It took me less than 30 minutes to do it all.
But you still put the activity up, right?
Yes.
Most everyone's back. You need to take attendance, right? Um, uh, hmm. So, James here. Was that James back there? Anybody know? Aisha, right? Tatum, Tatum, Tatum not here. David, David, Regina is here. Amy, right? Yeah. Autumn, um, Autumn, um, uh, Barbara and Cassie here. O'Shea is here. Sarah, Carson, Jamie, and Brandy, Joshua. So Autumn, that's either Autumn or James, and I can't remember which. So you're James, right? James? That's pronounced Jamie, Jayme. Okay, I'm sorry. Jamie. Okay, so that must be Autumn's stuff back there. Okay, she's not back from break yet. That's fine. Okay, is that too dark for anybody? Need more light? It's okay if you do, just say so. Okay, chapter 5. So now we're actually doing an organ system. So from now on, each chapter will be covering an organ system. This integumentary system is the skin. That's what integument means, the skin. This is the largest organ in the body. That means if we would take your skin off and weigh it, it would weigh more than any other organ. Here's a diagram showing the structure of the skin. The epidermis is the upper part, and the dermis is the bottom part. The dermis is much thicker than the epidermis, and the boundary or the interface between the epidermis and dermis is wavy or bumpy, as shown there. And beneath the dermis is this is called the hypodermis in this textbook, but some books call it the subcutaneous. And that's not considered part of the skin. It's below the skin. And that's, hypodermis has a lot of adipose or fat tissue in it, and some connective tissue, other connective tissues. The epidermis is mostly just skin cells, just layers of skin cells up there, but the dermis has a lot more stuff in it. It has blood vessels and nerves and sweat glands and oil glands, hair follicles, and these are sensory receptors for touch and pressure, and hot and cold. Okay, integument and cutaneous, those words both refer to skin. The epidermis is stratified squamous epithelium that has a lot of the protein keratin in those cells. Keratin is the same stuff that hair and fingernails and rhinoceros horns are made out of. Got a picture of, yeah, so here, this is epidermis. These are all cells of the epidermis, and just said that it's stratified squamous epithelium, even though these cells down here at the bottom, they're not nearly as flat, as thin and flat as the ones up near the top. Some of these cells are actually pretty thick, and they're almost, you could almost call them cuboidal. But when there are, in a case like this where the cells are thick at the bottom and thin at the top, we call them squamous, even just because the upper ones are thin and flat, even though they are not all thin and flat. Okay, where was I? Functions of skin. Protection. Skin is your first line of defense against bad stuff that could get into your body. Toxins, other bad chemicals, bacteria, viruses, ultraviolet radiation. Ultraviolet radiation is harmful to your cells because it can damage DNA, cause genetic mutations, which could lead to cancer. And your skin is pretty waterproof, so without skin, we would be losing a lot of water by evaporation and just water leaking out of our tissues. But skin holds water in. Thermoregulation, which means regulating temperature by evaporative cooling. That means when we sweat, the water in the sweat evaporates, and when water evaporates, it takes a lot of heat energy to do that. So the water that's left behind is cooled. Another way that skin regulates temperature is the blood vessels in the dermis of the skin. Those are right near the surface, and so if you're feeling cold, then those blood vessels near the surface will constrict to reduce the blood flow near the surface, because having all that blood flowing near the surface, we would lose heat from that blood. So as a means of conserving body heat, your body will constrict those blood vessels to reduce the heat loss. When you're feeling hot, those blood vessels will dilate, increase blood circulation near the surface to allow more heat from that blood to be lost to the surrounding air. So that's called vasodilation and vasoconstriction. Vaso means vessels, blood vessels. So dilation means getting bigger, constriction means getting narrower to regulate blood flow. Sensation, in our skin, we have a lot of different kinds of sensory receptors for touch, sort of tactile means touch, and for pressure. So pressure is just more force than touch. So we can detect very fine touch, or you can detect just a slight breeze blowing across your skin. But you can also detect when somebody pokes you hard. You can tell the difference between gentle touch and a hard pressure. Vibration, heat and cold, and pain. We have receptors for all of those in our skin. And so these are just special, they're either separate cells that respond to one of these kinds of things happening. They respond by sending a nerve impulse through a nearby neuron to the brain. Or some of these they're just neurons that are modified or specialized so that when that neuron is disturbed by pressure or pain or something, it'll send a nerve impulse to the brain. Another function of skin, making vitamin D. The active form of vitamin D, or to become active, vitamin D has to be produced by sunlight on the skin. Too much ultraviolet radiation on your skin is bad, but we need some. It should get at least 15 to 20 minutes of direct sun contact on your skin at least 3 times a week, something like that, to help produce enough vitamin D. Vitamin D acts as a hormone that causes the absorption of calcium from the food you're digesting into your blood. So if you don't have enough vitamin D, even if you're eating plenty of calcium, if you're not absorbing it, it's not doing you any good. This is just a list of effects, benefits of the integumentary system on other organ systems in your body. And I won't go through all of that in class. You can read that if you want. Again, here's another diagram of the skin with the epidermis at the top, and then dermis below that with all these structures: sweat glands, oil glands, hair follicles, blood vessels, nerves, and then the subcutaneous layer of adipose tissue or fat beneath that. You can see up there, it looks like the epidermis has been peeled off, and so you can see the bumpy surface where the epidermis meets the dermis. The word papilla, papilla here with an E on the end is papillae, which is plural, but the word papilla in anatomy just means bump. We see that word papilla a lot in anatomy. It always just means a bump. So those bumps are called dermal papillae. Okay, types of cells that are in the epidermis, the upper part of the skin. That's mostly this keratinocytes. Keratin is that protein again. It's a tough waterproof protein that's in skin and hair, or finger and toenails and hair. But it's also in skin cells of the epidermis. So they're called keratinocytes, the cells of the epidermis. And where's that picture? We have a picture. Well, so these are, almost all of these are keratinocytes, these cells of the epidermis. There's just a few other kinds of cells in among them, and those include melanocytes. They're called melanocytes because they make melanin. Melanin is a pigment or a color. It's a brownish, different shades of brown. So the melanocytes they make the melanin and they add, or they contribute the melanin to the keratinocytes so that your cells of your epidermis have color. And the more melanin you have, the darker your skin. And good thing about melanin is that it blocks ultraviolet radiation. So the more melanin you have in your skin, the better protection you have against ultraviolet radiation. So that's a good thing. In fact, even people with light skin, if they're out in the sun a lot, what happens? The skin gets darker, right? Because sunlight causes your melanocytes to make more melanin to protect you from all that sunlight that's coming in. But even if you get a suntan, you're still not going to have as much protection as somebody who's just naturally dark skinned, right? Intradermal macrophages, also called Langerhans cells, these are just white blood cells of the immune system that that live in our epidermis. So I don't see any labeled on here, but they would just be white blood cells that live in between these keratinocytes, and they just move around patrolling for any bacteria or anything that's trying to penetrate your epidermis to get inside of you. If they find it, they'll kill it and eat it. And then these tactile epithelial cells, or Merkel cells, these are sensory receptors for touch. So we have these in our epidermis, so anything that touches your epidermis is going to disturb that cell, and it's going to cause it to send a nerve impulse through this neuron. There's always a neuron right next to one of these Merkel cells that'll take that information to the brain, tells your brain there's something touching skin in that location. Okay, skin is either thin and hairy or thick and hairless. And the only place we have the thick, hairless skin is on the palms of the hands and the palm surfaces of the fingers and thumb, and on the bottoms of the feet. Everywhere else, our skin is thin, or is thin and hairy. So even though you might not be a very hairy person, you still, if you look real closely with a magnifying glass, you could probably find real fine hairs over most of your body. We'll see that in a minute, that the thick skin has an extra layer of cells, which makes it thicker and more protective. Thick skin does not have sebaceous glands. Those are the oil glands. Probably a good thing. You wouldn't want oil glands on the bottoms of your feet. Make it slippery. But they do. The thick skin does typically have sweat glands. Some people have very sweaty palms of their hands. Okay, the epidermis, the upper part of the skin, is made up of these layers of cells, and listed here. This is listed from top to bottom, and these are Latin names. Stratum means layer. It's like we saw that word stratified when we were talking about epithelial cell layers. So stratum just means layer, and so the top layer is a corneum. So that's the cell, what you're looking at on the top layers of skin. That's stratum corneum. That's actually many layers. Each of these are all more than one layers, except the bottom one. The stratum basale, that's just one layer, usually. And it says the stratum lucidum, the second one from the top, that's only in thick skin. So thin skin only has 4 layers. Thick skin, a 5th one. How these are remembered. This mnemonic, I think this is what the medical students use. come let's get sunburned. First letter of the words are the same. So here they're labeled, the stratum corneum at the top, then the stratum lucidum. That's the one that's only in the thick skin, and then stratum granulosum. It's called granulosum because you can see the little dots. Those are little, they're called granules, but they're just little vesicles with a fatty material that adds waterproofness to the skin. Then spinosum here, these layers are called the stratum spinosum. These are these cells are they're adding a lot of keratin. They're making and accumulating a lot of keratin in those cells. And then this very bottom layer is a stratum basale. Basale because it's the base layer. And these are the ones that are always dividing. So the cells at the top are always coming off, falling off, scraping off, wearing off. But we're always making new ones by this bottom layer, always dividing, making more cells, and they just move their way up. So these cells in this layer, pretty soon they'll be in this stratum spinosum layer. Then they'll move on up into the next layer and the next layer, and they change as they move up. They get thinner and flatter, and they die. By the time they get to the top, they're all dead. So those stratum corneum cells are dead. It's just like a little flat sack of keratin at that point. There's a melanocyte here in the stratum basale that adds pigment, adds color to the other cells. Here's one of those Merkel cells that's sensitive to touch. So if it gets disturbed, it sends a nerve impulse. It says sensory neuron there. And then this would all be dermis down here. Okay, what else? Okay, so there's a little description of each layer. Oh, a callus. If you work with your hands a lot, and so there's a lot of rubbing on the surface of your skin there, you'll form a callus, and that's just the stratum corneum getting thicker, just accumulating more layers to protect your skin from all that friction and rubbing and abrasion. Okay, there's just another diagram showing the different kinds of cells in the epidermis and the different layers. Same thing again, just a diagram or a drawing on the left and an actual photograph on the right. And this boundary between the epidermis and the dermis, it's wavy like this. That's why it looks like that, because of those dermal papillae, those bumps at the top of the dermis. Okay, practice questions. Some skin conditions. Albinism, this is a genetic. Congenital means you're born with it, but it's caused by a gene, and a person has to have 2 copies of this albinism gene to have this condition. And it's just a lack of pigment. The melanocytes don't function, don't make pigment in the skin and in the hair, and the irises of the eyes are very pale in people with albinism. And the vitiligo, lack of pigment in patches. It's not the whole body, just patches. And people are not born with this, or they don't. They can develop this later in life. I've had some friends who, when they were 20 years old started getting this patches of white on their chest, arms. It might be, it's thought it might be an autoimmune disease, so for some reason the person's immune system is attacking the melanocytes, so stop making pigment in those parts of the skin. There's a famous guy who I think had this. Anybody know who?
Michael Jackson.
Yeah, Michael Jackson. Um, didn't he? He had this, and so he got the rest of his skin bleached. Or, hard to know what to believe about stories of famous people, but that's I think what happened. Yeah, dandruff, just excessive shedding of the stratum corneum cells. Psoriasis, keratinocytes divide and move more quickly. So just overproduction of keratinocytes, so it forms those called plaques. There's just like thick layers of flaking skin. Yeah. Okay, so far we're talking a lot about the epidermis. There's 5 layers of skin. That's all in the epidermis. The dermis below that is much thicker. It's not made up of layers of cells like the epidermis. It's connective tissue with blood vessels and nerves and all that stuff in it. Has some dense irregular connective tissue to add strength to the skin. The dermis has two regions. They're not really layers, but regions. The upper layer is called the papillary region. That's where those dermal papillae are, the bumps on these bumps at the top of the dermis. And then below that is called the reticular part of the dermis. So the papillary has collagen and elastic fibers, areolar connective tissue, blood vessels, nerves, sensory receptors. The reticular, dense, irregular connective tissue, some fat toward the bottom. That's where the hair follicles are, oil glands, and some sensory receptors. So these oil glands and sweat glands and hair follicles are down in the dermis, but they connect to the glands have ducts or tubes that lead to the surface of the skin. The hair, even though the hair follicles are down in the dermis, the hair shaft penetrates up through the epidermis to the outside. Okay, these epidermal ridges are grooves. Grooves on the surface of the skin, and this is what leaves the fingerprints that are unique to every person. Okay, things that affect skin color. Already talked about melanin, which is a brownish pigment. So the more melanin that's produced, the darker the skin. Hemoglobin, which is not in the skin, it's in the red blood cells in the blood, but there are blood vessels in the dermis, so that redness of the blood can affect the color of the skin. And more in some people than others. Some people, their faces get really red sometimes. Other people, it doesn't happen. Some people have rosacea. I don't know what causes that. That's because of blood vessels in the skin. And this last one, keratin. This is a yellow-orange pigment that we don't produce that. Our bodies don't make this pigment, but some people have a lot of it just because they eat a lot of food that has carotene in it, and it can make some people's skin look orange. What's an orange? What's a kind of food that has a lot of this in it? Yeah, carrots. Yeah. And some people who eat a lot of carrots, their skin, I guess, turns orange. My color vision is so bad I can't tell stuff like that. One time, when I was in my 20s, I used to live in Colorado, and it was on Halloween, and I was like a sidewalk cafe in Boulder, Colorado, and with a couple of friends. And in this place, all the waitresses were dressed up for Halloween, except our waitress. She wasn't dressed up for Halloween. She just looked normal, and yet these guys I was with, every time she'd come and wait on us, and then she'd walk away, they would make some kind of comment about her, like just something sarcastic, like she's really hot or something. And I said, what are you talking about? I could tell they were being sarcastic, but I didn't get it. And then it turned out she wasn't wearing a costume. She had just painted herself green, her face and arms. She was green, and I didn't even notice because I'm so colorblind. I just thought she had a nice tan. But I hate being colorblind.
Have you ever tried those glasses?
Are they electronic? Or,
No, there's like some glasses that they make for people that are colorblind.
I don't know. No, I've heard of some that one lens is red and the other is green or something. I don't know. I don't think that would work. I think there are some very expensive electronic glasses that are supposed to work for color blindness. I don't know. It's just an inconvenience. It's certainly not a hardship compared to what other people deal with. Okay, in the dermis, there's different kinds of sensory receptors, and you don't need to learn the names of all these, but some of these are for light touch, some are for pressure, some for vibrations, hot and cold. Other structures in the skin that are considered part of the integumentary system: hair, sebaceous glands, sudoriferous glands. These are sweat glands. So you need to know that word sudoriferous. That means sweat. Ceruminous glands. Those are the earwax glands. We have them only in the ear canals, and then the nails. Okay, hair. Hair is not alive. The actual hair is threads of just continuous keratin proteins. Start out as cells in the follicles. They start out as being produced like cells, but they die right away, and they just become these long strands of keratin protein. Genetics determines most of the characteristics of hair, and even if you stop having hair at some point. Alopecia, that just means lack of hair, and there are different forms of this. Some people just at some point in their life they just lose all of their hair on their body, even their eyebrows and eyelashes. But even what I have is considered a type of alopecia. Just regular males losing their hair. That's a type of alopecia, and it's genetic. You know what's really not fair? I have 3 brothers, so there's 4 of us, and color blindness is also genetic, and two of us are both colorblind and losing our hair. The other 2 have they have normal color vision, and they have all their hair. That's not fair at all. Okay, Parts of the hair. The shaft is the hair above the hair itself above the skin. The root is the base of the hair down in the. I'm sorry, I'm jumping around. The root is the base of the hair down in the follicle where it's being produced. And the follicle is down in the dermis, surrounds the base, the root of the hair, and that's where it grows. So this is the shaft up here. The root of the hair is down here, surrounded by the follicle, which produces the hair. And there's also, it's not shown here, but hair follicles have their own melanocytes. It's not the same melanocytes that add color to the skin. The hair's follicles have their own melanocytes that add color. So that's why you can have dark skin and light hair, or light skin and dark hair, because there's separate melanocytes for both. You see here that these sebaceous glands or oil glands, they're always next to a hair. They're always associated with hair follicle. And so the oil from these sebaceous glands, it comes out along the hair shaft to the outside. So where there's no hair, like the palms of the hands and the bottom of the feet, there's also no sebaceous glands, no oil glands. Okay, these erector pili muscles, this labeled here, this is a little tiny, very tiny little muscle, and that's smooth muscle, so it's involuntary, but it's always attached to the base of a hair, and when that muscle contracts, it makes the hair stand up, and it also makes a little bump. Where that muscle contracts, it makes a little bump. That's what's the common name for that? Common term for that? Goosebumps. That's what goosebumps are. It's just goosebumps are just the erector pili muscles contracting, and that's not very important in humans, but it's considered to be just leftover from our ancestors who were covered with hair. And if you're an animal covered with hair, it can be really important to be able to stand your hair up on end, because normally your hair is laying down flat. If it stands up, it makes a thicker layer of insulation to keep you warm in the wintertime. That's why a lot of animals in the summer, their hair might be laying down. In the winter, it stands up. Same thing with birds. They have the same thing on their feathers. You probably notice the birds that stay here over winter instead of going farther south, like little chickadees overwinter here. If you see them outside on a really cold day, they look like they're real fat. Because their feathers are all standing up on end to make a thicker layer of insulation to keep them warm. This also happens when an individual is under stress. It'll cause goosebumps. Even in people, some kinds of stress cause goosebumps. Or if you're cold, you might get goosebumps, even though you don't have enough hair on your body to keep you warm if they stand up. But in other animals, if a dog, if you see a dog with the hair on his back is standing up, if that's a Rottweiler, you're going to try to pet that. That means that dog's in a bad mood, usually, right? So you keep your distance. Okay. This might seem trivial, but and I was talking to one of the nursing instructors once, and she said this showed up on a T's exam, the erector pili muscles, and we were talking, why is that important enough to be on a T's exam? Who cares about goosebumps? But it's not really. Goosebumps is not a condition that most nurses have to deal with or treat. It's not a disease. Okay, practice questions. Okay, sebaceous glands, the oil glands. Again, connected to hair follicles, sorry. So it prevents the skin and hair from drying out, makes your skin and hair more waterproof. Usually become more functional at puberty. Which is when acne starts in some people, and acne can be caused by just blocked hair follicles, so the sebum accumulates in there, and then bacteria feed on that sebum and cause little infections there. Okay, sudoriferous or sweat glands. For cooling, as the water evaporates, it cools you down. Also, this is one way of getting rid of some waste products, that's what excretion is, just getting rid of waste products. Because sweat has salt in it, and urea, and ammonia, lactic acid, these are all waste products produced by cells. And so sweat is pretty similar to urine. Got some of the same stuff in it as urine. It's a way of getting rid of some of this stuff that we have too much of in our body. Sweat is slightly acidic, so it prevents growth of some kinds of bacteria and stuff on our skins. Bacteria and fungi love to grow on any moist surface. If there's something to eat, they'll grow there. And that would include the surface of your body. Sorry. Two types of sweat glands, the eccrine and apocrine sweat glands. The eccrine ones are mostly for cooling. And so this is the kind of sweat that happens when you're hot. And we have these covering most of our body. We have this kind of sweat glands. But the other kind, the apocrine sweat glands, these is associated with hair follicles in only certain parts of the body: armpits, nipples, genitals, eyelids, and ears. And these produce sweat not necessarily when you're hot, but under certain times of stress and sexual excitement. Or both at the same time, maybe. And it has its own odor. It has its own smell. This kind of sweat, it doesn't have its own smell, but of course, if you're hot a lot and you sweat a lot, you will start to smell if you don't bathe after a few days. But that's just because of bacteria growing in that sweat. Even though it has antibacterial stuff in it, if you don't bathe for a few days, you're going to start to smell from eccrine perspiration. But this apocrine, it has its own smell to it, and that's why I got the question mark pheromones. Is that pheromones are chemicals that one individual releases, and it affects another individual. And this is how many kinds of wild animals attract mates, and even domestic dogs. If you have a female dog and she goes into heat, which means she is sexually receptive to males, male dogs will show up. How do they know? It's because of pheromones. She's putting out an odor that male dogs can smell from a long way, and it'll attract them. Those are pheromones. Even a lot of insects do have pheromones. Moths, those fuzzy antennae on moths. That's their smell organs. That's how they detect pheromones from a female a mile away. Ants and social insects like that have several different kinds of pheromones, each with a different message. But I got a question mark because it's an unsettled question. Do humans have pheromones? And some people say, yeah, absolutely. You might be a person who's very much affected by the smell of a person of the opposite sex or same sex. Some people say, no, that's just other animals. I don't know. Okay, so here's one of these eccrine sweat glands. It's just a tube surrounded by uh, glandular epithelium producing sweat into that tube that leads to the surface of the skin. Okay, ceruminous glands, earwax glands. So these are in the ear canal, just outside of the eardrums. So this word cerumen means earwax. So it's believed to be there just for protection of the eardrum. Nails, we don't need to know a whole lot of details about nails, but the nail body is the nail itself. The matrix is the layer of cells right below the nail body, and then it's not labeled on here, but the cuticle is around the edge here, and this lunula that's hard to see there, but that's that half moon shape, usually lighter color at the base of the nail. You guys ever lose a toenail you get your toe smashed and lose a toenail? Or, it's happened to me many times because I've been a runner all my life, and sometimes I wear shoes that don't fit right, and I go out for a long run, and then I have to get a black toenail, and it falls off later. Okay, nails are, again, made of keratin protein. The nail itself is not alive. Kind of protects the ends of the fingers and toes. That's what digits means, fingers and toes. Can be helpful in grasping and manipulating, scratching and grooming, I guess. More stuff. We don't need to know all these details. More stuff we don't need to know. Okay, hypodermis or subcutaneous. Yeah, I already talked about that. That's below the skin. Mostly a layer of fat for fat storage, storing energy for later, and also thermal insulation to keep us warm. Healing. Oh, okay. I already talked in the last chapter. Talked about a little bit about healing, but difference between epidermal wound healing and deep wound healing. Epidermal means healing a wound that's only through the epidermis. Doesn't go deep into the dermis at all. So that's pretty simple. So this this is the epidermis up here. So if there's a cut just through the epidermis, not even into the dermis, that's no big deal. All that has to happen is these stratum basale cells, the bottom layer of the epidermis, have to just move in, fill in the space, and then these cells are always dividing, so they'll just make more cells to rebuild new epidermis here, and it won't even be a scar. It'll just look like normal epidermis. But if it's this deep wound healing, so it goes through the dermis and subcutaneous layers, maybe even below that into muscle or something. It's more complicated. So there's four steps involved. They're listed here: inflammatory, migratory, proliferative, and maturation. So the inflammatory, a scab forms, and I think that's this stuff described. Inflammatory blood clot forms, white blood cells migrate or move to the area, and increased blood flow, so inflammation, and that will often, this inflammation from increased blood flow will make it feel hot and maybe swollen. Migratory, to migrate means to move, so epithelial cells will migrate. Inflammatory. Oh, so this only shows the first and last step, but missing something. But anyway, the migratory phase, epithelial cells or the epidermal cells will just like in the epidermal wound healing, these epidermal cells will move in and fill in the cut. Fibroblasts from connective tissue will come and fill in with collagen fibers. Then proliferative, to proliferate means to grow, so epithelial cells grow, replacing the epithelial layers. Fibroblasts are adding collagen fibers. Then the maturation phase, the final phase, the scab comes off. The epidermis is normal, but there still will probably be a visible scar because of all the collagen fibers beneath the epidermis. And especially if it doesn't heal flat, if there's a little recess where the cut was, that'll be obvious as well. Scar tissue is not it's not the same as normal skin tissue. Looks different. It's often not a little bit more fragile. It get re-injured easier. Okay. More bad news about getting old. Wrinkles develop because the skin just isn't as firm because you have less of the collagen and elastic protein fibers in the skin because the fibroblasts aren't making them as much. Dehydration and cracking more likely to occur. Less sweat. Decrease in functional melanocytes, so skin and hair typically lose color. A lot of people, their hair goes gray. That just means that the melanocytes and their hair follicles stop working. Skin, I've noticed my skin is not. My skin used to be darker, and I would get suntan much easier when I was younger. Now, I hardly ever get suntan, even though I'm outside pretty much. Atypical skin pigmentation. Atypical means not normal, not typical. Can have light patches and dark patches. People get age spots, which are just dark spots in their skin. Subcutaneous fat is lost. General decrease in thin skin thickness. People's the loss of fat beneath the skin, along with the loss of protein fibers in the skin, it makes many people their faces start to look just thinner as they get older. They just don't have the fat beneath their skin to puff their skin out. So their skin just gets thinner and weaker. It sags, gets wrinkly. Sounds attractive, right? Subcutaneous fat, atrophy of sebaceous glands. So skin produces less oil, and the nails can become more brittle. Um, something that's interesting to do to compare the skin of somebody old like me to somebody young like you guys are all way younger than me. You take a pinch of your skin on the back of your hand, pull it up, and let go. Most of you, it'll snap back in a second, maybe half a second. You know, on me, it takes several seconds for it to go all the way down and stretch back to where to normal. Okay, you guys going to be in nursing profession or something like that? I hope you never have to deal with this kind of thing. But if you dealing with um, bedridden people, or even wheelchair-bound people sometimes, it's called pressure ulcers or bed sores, just from a person's own body weight being concentrated in certain areas for a long period of time. Some people get it on their hips or their butt or anywhere where there's pressure on the surface, the bed that they're lying on or the wheelchair they're sitting in. um, that something like that in an old person, it'd be really hard to get that to heal, especially if that person is diabetic. It might never heal. If that's a diabetic person. It can be really serious. Skin cancer, need to talk about that. Because some skin cancers are some of the most deadly kinds of cancers and pretty common. Skin cancer is caused by mutations in DNA. Cells just start dividing out of control because the genes that control the cell division are mutated. They're changed. They don't work anymore. Now the cell doesn't know when to stop dividing. So they just divide and divide and divide out of control. Those cells from that division, they don't become normal functioning cells. They just disrupt the normal functions of the normal cells. And because skin cells are so near, they're right at the surface, they're exposed to ultraviolet radiation from the sun or anything else in the environment. Your skin is maybe the most likely tissue to get it, to be exposed to it. And because your basal skin cells, your stratum basale, they're always dividing. Every time a cell divides, that's an opportunity for a mistake in the DNA, an opportunity for a mutation to happen, which could lead to cancer. So that's why these basal cell carcinoma in the stratum basale cells, that's very, very common, 78% of skin cancer. But they're dividing all the time. Every time they divide, especially if sunlight's hitting them, there could be a mistake in copying the DNA when the cells are replicated. But the good news, there's rarely metastasize. That means, what does metastasize mean? Spread to other tissues. It usually doesn't spread. So if you get this kind of skin cancer, at least it's probably not going to spread to other tissues. Squamous cell carcinoma, so that's in the stratum spinosum cell, a layer above the stratum basale. It's in 20% of skin cancers, but often spreads. And then the malignant melanoma, that's less common, but it's more dangerous. It occurs in the melanocytes. of the epidermis, and it's only 2% of skin cancers, but it rapidly spreads and can kill you within months. So here's something you need to look for in a patient. If you see a mole that looks like this compared to this is a more normal looking mole. It's small and kind of round, and the edges are sharp. They're not. They don't. It's different from these. This one's large, abnormal. It's an irregular shape, and the edges are kind of blurry. Just fade into the surrounding lighter colored skin. So it might be nothing, but it's something that needs to be checked out for sure. And any mole that changes over time. I mean, this one, the mole like that might have looked that way that person's whole life, so it's nothing wrong with it. But if it used to look like that and now it looks like that, then it's something's happening, maybe cancer. Okay, burns. We're almost done here. Caused by heat, electricity, radioactivity, corrosive chemicals. So either acids or bases can cause chemical burns. If they're strong acid or strong base. So it destroys skin cells, which can lead to dehydration. If a large part of a person's body is burned, there's no longer skin protecting from infection, keeping water in. So this person could be losing a lot of water and electrolytes in that water, that's the tissue fluid that's being lost. Burns are graded or judged according to how deep they are and also how much of the body is affected. So first degree, second degree, third degree, also called partial thickness and full thickness. First degree burn, that's just like a sunburn or just a mild burn. It heals. It's only the epidermis. There's no blistering. Heals on its own in a few days. It'll hurt. And the skin it'll recover just fine. It doesn't mean there's no damage though, because sunburn, the damage to skin through many sunburns accumulates, so that it can cause premature aging of skin and also could lead to skin cancer. Second degree burns through the epidermis into the dermis. The epidermis will usually separate from the dermis, and that'll be a blister with water or tissue fluid accumulating in between. Redness, pain, swelling. Doesn't require skin grafts or anything. It'll just take longer to heal. But third degree, entirely through the dermis into the subcutaneous, so it'll be very painful, except in the center of the burn, where all of the sensory receptors and neurons are burned away. There won't be pain, but around the edges is probably where the pain comes from. Very susceptible to infection, slow healing. Because there's no skin underneath there, it can't heal from below. It's going to have to heal from the edges in, and that'll take forever. So usually that might require skin grafts to heal. This rule of nines, it's a way of estimating the surface area of the body that's burned, and this is just an estimate. It's not very accurate necessarily, but even paramedics in the field would use this. When there's a burn victim with burns over much of the body, paramedics, by the time they get to the hospital and roll them into the ER, they've come up with an estimate what percentage of the body is burned, and they don't actually measure anything. They they just use this rule of nines, so, call it the rule of nines because it's just, it's been estimated that, certain areas of the body, are considered to be some percentage of the entire body, and those numbers are multiples of 9. So this is 2 times 9 is 18. The trunk, 36%, that's 4 times 9. Each of the arms is 9%. So they don't, even if only part of an arm is burned, they'll just call that 9%. And so they'll just add them all up and come up with a number, an estimate of the total burn area. Okay, another condition, callus, where we talked about that, bed sores, keloid. It's a big, thick scar that's scar tissue that it can actually keep growing and accumulating. And it's not necessarily in healing, it's just scar tissue that keeps forming. So people get this in parts of their body. Some people get it on their ears, and it just keeps getting bigger and bigger. Or can happen just about anywhere. We already talked about scars, stretch marks, any increase in size of part of your body that causes the skin can't grow fast enough to keep up with it. It'll cause stretch marks. So pregnancy often causes that. Okay, some videos if you want to look at them. Okay, that's all. Okay. So no exam next week. I'll change the schedule. It'll be in 2 weeks. Okay. Again, if you want your exam from last week, you can pick it up tonight. If you have trouble with that lab, I'll stick around for a while if you need help working that out. You do? Okay. Jamie and David. Looks like Jamie. And most of these don't have names. So remember if you put your name on, that's yours. So if you didn't put your name on, then it won't matter which one. Okay, yeah, just pick a blank one. Which one? Sam? What is it? Who?
Tatum. Yeah, we're the name on the top.
There you are. And I think I saw one of these with your name, which is fine.
Yeah.
Yes. Oh, there it is.
Thank you.
What else? Brandon.
Yes.
Andy, and I don't think you put your name on the exam.
I don't think so.
so I'll just give you a blank one.
Thank you.
You want an exam or help?
Both.
Okay. Yeah, Barbara, hold on.
That was on.
Oh, okay, yes, you know.
Now, do I have to have this open while I'm doing the lab?
Yeah, that is the lab. That is that is the lab activity.
Okay, so I have to use, I have this open and that open at the same
Oh.
time?
Click on the Well, the time it,
That's not fine. I don't think it's fine. Yeah, yeah, you need the instructions.
Okay, so have this open and that open at the same time?
No, not there's another thing that you need to have open. I forget what it's called. Let me see what I got Moodle here.
Lab 4, June.